Well, that was pretty remarkable. And I think there are people in the audience who actually want us to cede our time back to Tom Hanks, but we're not going to do it. But I just want to show of hands, how many of you actually think maybe Tom Hanks should run for president? And I also want to say Jamie did a wonderful job of thanking everybody here except for one person. And I think we all are in debt of somebody who's put together the most remarkable Writers' Festival, I think, in the country, maybe the world. We're all tremendous beneficiaries of it, and that is the founder, our leader, Jamie Kabler. Please join me in congratulating Jamie. It's really quite remarkable. We have a really interesting panel here, and we're going to only, because there are four of us, four of them, one of me, try to get a few topics. But I just want to say, as we go around the table, I'm not going to interview them at any length. You know that you read Bret's column in the New York Times. Used to read it in the Wall Street Journal. Sometimes you love it, probably sometimes you hate it. That's what makes him a great columnist. And we're going to talk a minute about his other participation he's had here. Karl Rove, I love him as a wonderful historian. Others remember him as a major political figure or somebody's brain. Jon Meacham, I'm hoping as we have this conversation, actually we'll have a chance to have a rebuttal. Jon, I think you have a chance to get back on behalf of all those shows you're on MSNBC.
Yeah, well, he's watching apparently, so he needs to get out more. But,
and Doug Brinkley, who plays so many different roles, writes about so many wonderful things, teaches great stuff, but I have to say also is the CNN historian, which is why the current president invited him to talk to him about history, because he knew about you from television. So maybe if you watch more MSNBC, Jon, you'd get that same invitation.
Thanks much, but I'm okay.
But, I want to start with a question, ask you all to talk about this. 2 years ago, and I think that some people were here 2 years ago, some were not, but 2 years ago we had a fascinating session here. Wasn't yet refurbished in the wonderful way that Helene Galen has made possible. Thank you, Helene, for this amazing, beautiful place. But we met here on the first days, literally first days of the new Trump administration. And here we are 2 years later at a festival of writers and books, and I bothered to count how many, or had somebody count for me, how many books there have been about Donald Trump in those 2 years. And it's at least 48 books. At least 48 books in those 2 years. And by the way, there are weeks, there was a story once about how many weeks in a row, months in a row, the #1 book on the New York Times bestseller list was a book, not the same book, different books, about Donald Trump. But of course, I think there are more books in a shorter period of time about Donald Trump than about any president, but there have been a lot of books, and I can, if anybody's interested, give you a flavor of how many per president. But I think as we have this great panel of historians and thinkers and columnists and people who've been in government, I'd love to have your reactions to how much we really can know 2 years into a presidency. Presidencies change. I think if you had, if Obama was 2 years into the presidency, it'd be different than it was 8 years in the presidency or 12 years later, or the same thing for Reagan, or the same before Reagan was shot, how different things were, or the same thing with Clinton. The defining things often take place later. And I wonder if I could ask, starting with Bret, you to talk a little bit about what one can learn from the early years of a presidency and what's written about a presidency, and how much difference it makes to have the distance of time.
Looking at it historically, the answer is you learn very little. Abraham Lincoln, in the early years of his presidency, as the war was going badly, was, I think, described as the original baboon. Dwight Eisenhower was an idiot. Kennedy was magnetic and brilliant, and then you had other presidencies. The first 2 years of Reagan's presidency, of course, were economically fraught, and the cliche about Reagan was that he was an empty vessel and a kind of, I think, what was the word? The phrase amiable dunce is what Tip O'Neill called him. It was only later when you started to look at his diaries,
Which Doug Brinkley so brilliantly edited.
his writings clearly not given to him by Peggy Noonan or his other speechwriters, but rather, in his own name, that you saw a much deeper figure. Thanks to John, we are in the midst of a major reevaluation of George H.W. Bush and the skill with which he managed the transition from the Cold War to the prosperity of the 1990s. I think Bill Clinton looks much worse now. So you learn, I think, rather little. I would only say that the Trump presidency is unlike any we've had in our history, in that I think what we know now is almost certainly what we will know in 2 years or 6 or whatever it is. I would wager that we are not going to uncover the diary work of Donald Trump, which will open up new vistas into the man's inner life. We're in a kind of a what you see is what you get kind of presidency. The only other thing I would say is that we have to be careful, because we also judge a presidency by its results. And if in 2 years' time, Tom Hanks alluded to this, or I shouldn't say 2 years, 20 months' time, we have an economy with 3.5 or 3.6% unemployment and robust growth figures above 3%, and the stock market hasn't tanked, many people will be seeing the presidency in a different light.
Karl, you lived with this. I mean, not only a historian, I urge everybody to read your book on McKinley, but you live day to day with a presidency, and you're a real reader. We talked last time about how you had that readers club with President Bush. How accurate from inside of that world does it seem to be watching the press and to be watching the early books?
Well, I think Bret captured it. It's too early. Most of them. You have 3 or 4 different kinds of books. You have the ideological books that are written by both your friends and your adversaries. A lot of them with preconceived notions. Then you have sort of the Woodward style books, the sort of the old gray eminences of current history writing who come in and write them. But you know what? They're looking at it from, it's like the elephant with the blind man. So, somebody's got a familiarity with the trunks, somebody's got a familiarity with the belly, someone's got a familiarity with the tail, but they don't see the whole thing. It's only time and distance. But the books are somewhat valuable in that they sort of convey information, but the early books particularly, it strikes me, are an attempt by people to, sometimes to settle scores or to shape the narrative to their own peculiar advantage. Certainly to the advantage of the administration if they're inside it, but even then it's sort of like, we're the people who did the right, we would see, you could see Richard Armitage without his name in any Woodward book shaping the narrative on behalf of Colin Powell being the only sensible adult in the room, confronting that idiot Colin Powell and that neophyte Connie Rice.
One of the most revealing sentences in any Bob Woodward book is Colin Powell was worried.
Yeah.
How does he know?
Yeah, Richard Armitage. But there is one thing.
Karl, when you're reading books about periods you've known, you're kind of reading them with uncredited footnotes?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. Now, but there is something different here, though. There are 2 things that are different here. First of all, I'm shocked by how many books have come out that are negative in nature from inside Trump world.
Yeah.
I mean, I think our first negative book from inside Bush world was Scott McClellan's book about 3.5 or 4 years in. Think about it. This week we've got 2. We got Sims and Christie out there, and
it's only Tuesday.
Yeah. And the other thing is the interplay between, between cable TV and the book writers, because they seem to get a lot more attention. But look, inside, you got more important things to do. Everybody does the wash and read. I'm in here, page 107. But there's not a lot of attention paid to them because there's not much you can do about them. There was one that came out from two idiots in Texas entitled Bush's Brain, which was the official biography of moi. And I'm like nervous about it. And because, they're clearly trying to diminish the guy who never graduated from college after going to the University of Utah, University of Maryland, George Mason University, University of Houston, and University of Texas at Austin, and versus the guy who is the history major from Yale and the Harvard MBA. So I'm that guy's brain. And it's clearly an attempt to diminish him by, sort of elevating me. And I'm sort of nervous about it because I'm mostly about my colleagues because they think I'd be a hot dog. And this gigantic package arrives in my office, elaborately wrapped package. And I open the package, and it is a copy. It is a game, Brainiac, with the presidential seal on the top of it, and a note from the boss saying, "Don't worry about it." And that's sort of semi-constructive about how you have to deal with these things generally. But this play between the cable TV guys and the authors of these things, they seem to me to with the exception of Woodward, who always got attention because he's a favorite of all of the people on this stage except me, and they get a lot more attention.
One problem, though, of course, with all the books that have come out with Trump is they're typically written by journalists, but as far as I know, none have been written by psychiatrists yet.
He's the most interesting negative book, though, is the book that was written by Steve Bannon using a ghostwriter. I mean, I've never seen it. This is the equivalent of like 1963 or 62, whenever it was in Saigon, with the nun who pours the gasoline on himself, and not to suggest that Steve Bannon is a nun or a priest, but pours the gasoline on himself and throws the match on himself and immolates him. What that guy was thinking by giving those interviews and discussing so openly his views about his commander is a little remarkable.
Jon, you not only are a great historian, have written great, although I don't know what point you decided you were a historian, because you had done wonderful cover stories for Newsweek and been editor and so forth. But maybe I could ask you to broaden the topic and sort of think about how accurate are these long pieces that you'd have, long magazine pieces, as well as the books. And you've covered, written about so much of history. You read the history that was written by other people as you're doing that history. Yeah. How do you look at this?
Well, I've done lots of dead white guys and one living white guy who's now no longer with us, but George H.W. Bush.
By the way, we're taking bids. Jamie, if he ever needs money for this festival, is going to try to take money to ask Jon Meacham to write their eulogy.
Yes, it's a.
But Jon, just one thing about it.
This offer is only good tonight, $50,000.
but
after
Jon,
tonight, it will be $75,000 for those that are under the age of 80, and $100,000 for those over there. But if you're in, I'm happy to take the orders tonight. $50,000, your eulogy in person, Jon Meacham, ladies and gentlemen.
But actually, an amazing thing people may not know about that eulogy, maybe this was written, I didn't know it, was that you actually read it to George Herbert Walker Bush.
I did. He asked me a couple of years ago to do this, and of course now I thought that was the guarantee for eternal life, because the book I did on him was supposed to be posthumous, but the son of a bitch wouldn't die. I mean, for decades. So we finally just went ahead and pulled the trigger on it. But so yeah, I went up in July, and we all go to a lot, particularly in this demographic, we all go to a lot of funerals, right? And you always leave thinking, boy, I wish they could have heard that, right? So I thought, well, why not just go read it to them? And and it's funny, I offered to do the same with Mrs. Bush, and she was not interested. She knew I was so scared of her, it was going to be fine. But I went up and I read it, and I swear to God, he said this. He said, "That's an awful lot about me." It's your eulogy, sir. Remember his voice, as Dana Carvey said, the way to do Bush 41 is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne, and I'm not going to do it. I think, I was just sitting here thinking, I totally agree with Bret and Karl, and then my eye fell on Rick Atkinson, who wrote, I think, a book on the first Gulf War, Crusade, that I don't think has been superseded in its historiography. I used it for the Bush book. So it depends. There's some contemporary history and journalism that stands up wonderfully, and there's some, and I've done a lot of it, that's terrible. It's kind of like what Hanks was talking about. It's life, right? You know, you get some right, you get some wrong. I will say this: the news magazine era, which really began in 1921 or so. Where's Norm? What year was? Am I wrong? Sorry.
Norm Pearlstein,
23.
who for years was the editor-in-chief of Time Inc.
So Time was in 23, Newsweek was in 33, and those are immense riches for those of us who write about American life in that period, because you had a lot of really smart people in New York and in Washington, but trying to pretend they understood what was going on in the country. It was still a dynamic that unfolds to some extent. And so you have this magazine that gives you this insight into what people thought was going on. And so I highly recommend those for any trying to recapture the feel of any moment. But that's the difference between journalism and history. If George H.W. Bush had tragically not had his wonderful almost 30 years after he left the White House, it would have been a very different view. If he had died in February of 1993, he would have died as a one-term president that a lot of folks thought was hopelessly out of touch, was all the cliches of 1992. Remember when Bill Clinton went on Arsenio Hall and played the saxophone? George Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Yale. I mean, he had no idea. So, I took Latin there. He had no idea. So that would have been the caricature. But now we know, as Bret generously says, that handling the end of the deadliest standoff in human history without a shot being fired, setting the conditions for the prosperity of the 1990s was essential. He passed big domestic legislation that was important. And as we've seen ever more so in recent years, simply trying to govern in a climate of congeniality and compromise is a virtue. And people thought he was, the joke was it 88, I think. People said that the problem with George Bush and women voters was that he reminds every woman of their first husband. Well, boy, we'll take that first husband now, right? So I think it depends on the creation of it. And some things you realize are that you absolutely believe turn out to not be the case. There's a wonderful story about Dean Acheson and Arthur Schlesinger having lunch at the Century in New York one day. And Acheson's been working on his memoir. He comes in and he orders a Century martini, which is basically 3 martinis in one glass, and drinks it down. And Arthur says, "What's wrong, Dean?" He says, "Well, I was just writing about the recognition of Israel this morning. And I remember I was sitting in the Oval Office. I remember the dust and the sunlight that was coming through, streaming through the windows when Truman made the decision. And it was this remarkable day. And I just checked my diary, and I was in Germany." But he told himself this story all these years later. One final anecdote like that. Do you remember Charlie McDowell?
Yeah.
From the Richmond
Yeah,
Times-Dispatch. He was an early kind of Washington TV guy. Lovely guy. He was in the White House with...
He's the voice in the Civil War.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Burns had him in the Civil War.
Lovely, lovely guy. So he's a classic newspaper guy. And goes to the White House from Lexington, Virginia. Goes to the White House in 1983 and sits next to Reagan at a lunch and says, "Mr. President, I've always wanted to tell you this, but you were a hugely important part of my childhood." And Reagan said, why is that? And he said, well, when you all were shooting Brother Rat, Eddie Albert movie, in 1939, 40, you and Ann Sheridan and Eddie Albert, when you were shooting that in Lexington, you were in the drugstore one day having a hamburger, and we stood around and we said, this is the great world. This is Hollywood. They've come to our little town. And Reagan's going, yes, yes. And he said, Charlie says, that really gave me the energy and the passion to really look beyond my town, and thank you for that. And Reagan said, that's great. You know, Charlie, I've never been to Lexington, Virginia. He'd shot it on a soundstage out here. And McDowell said, but Mr. President, that's impossible. I remember it so well. He said, oh, that's all right. I do it all the time.
But, you know, this is something I think that those of us who have worked in history see all the time, that the things that are written, whether it's in memoirs.
Oh,
or
God. Yeah. Oh, Lord, memoirs are, you know, the subtitle of every Washington memoir should be, if only they'd listened to me. You know, that's, so there's that, except for Karl's, of course, which is a great.
Mine was, they made the mistake of listing.
That was, yeah. It did better for that. But I had the advantage, the great advantage I had in doing the senior President Bush was he gave me his presidential diary, which is about 550,000, 600,000 words of transcripts. He talked into a tape recorder 2 or 3 times a week, very disciplined about it. Air Force One, Marine One, Camp David, you can hear the blades of the helicopter. You know, he wanted to do it. Made a point of buying the tapes himself with cash so the government wouldn't own it. Very precise about that. And I'm going through it, and I had the experience with a lot of folks that Karl knows better than I do, of going to very senior officials of the government in the Reagan-Bush years and saying, this is what the president was saying, what do you think? And at least 4 household names that you all would understand looked at me and said, well, that's not what he thought. And I'm like, well, here's the tape, you know. And it was a sign of, with Bush, it was totally characteristic. He never wanted to complain about the loneliness of the office. He never wanted to complain about other people to other people. He thought, as he once put it, people don't want to hear presidents complain about the burdens of the office. We all wanted this thing, and we were supposed to take it. Novel. So he used this diary as his therapeutic device. He didn't want to bellyache around him, so he bellyached to himself. And there's a lesson in that, I think, for all of us.
Doug, I want you to talk about the same thing, but first of all, I want to pick up for a minute about Reagan's diaries. Because Edmund Morris sort of famously said there was no there there. And if you read those diaries, and I've only read the parts that you edited, there was a lot of there there.
I got a telephone call from Pete Wilson of California, and Pete asked me if I wanted to edit Ronald Reagan's diaries. And he told me he kept them every day in an office except for a few days when Reagan was shot. And I said, yes. And he said, whoa, wait. There's some ground rules here. One is, first I want you to come out to the Reagan Library and look at them. And you're not going to be able to Xerox anything, so you'd have to kind of work out of the Reagan Library at Simi Valley. And you have to pass the Nancy Reagan test. Ooh. Now, I was like, what's the Nancy Reagan test? He said, well, I'll help you with it, but you're very interested. He said, I think David McCullum mentioned me for doing this, what started it. But at any rate, the Nancy Reagan test was, he said, when you're going to meet her at the Beverly Hills Hotel, but do not mention Edmund Morris. Whatever you do, don't say the name Edmund Morris, because he had fictionalized in Dutch. Edmund Morris is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, Theodore Rex, great TR biographer. He's writing an incredible biography right now on Thomas Edison. Edmund's a great friend, but he had a big publishing contract with Reagan. They were demanding the money. He fictionalized it, and Nancy Reagan felt she picked the wrong biographer for her husband.
And by the way, didn't he also get to to live inside the White House for part of
Yeah,
the
he was in Reykjavik for these meetings, and also may have been a blown opportunity, but she felt so terrible that her judgment, the gatekeeper to Ronald Reagan, had picked the wrong match. And I said, all right. And he said, and if you get in a jam in your conversation with her, talk about Hollywood movies. And I said, do you mean Mrs. Reagan's Hollywood? She goes, no, like now. Like what's the new Brad Pitt movie? What is he said, just keep it going and don't let her drag you into the Edmund Morris fight. The problem was they had the Diaries, the Reagan people, Duke and others out there at Simi Valley, Karl, they wanted them out, but she was worried it wouldn't work well. So I went to the hotel and I met her, and I'm not a conservative, unlike Bret and Karl.
He's not a conservative?
And I wanted Miss
You were
Reagan to know
misinformed.
that. I wanted Mrs. Reagan to know that, and I said, Mrs. Reagan, you know, we were getting, she ordered the Nancy Reagan Cobb salad, and we were in the Nancy Reagan booth. And at one point I said, Mrs. Reagan, you know, I'm not, I want to do this, but I think you need to know I'm not a conservative, and you might have some people of the conservative movement wonder why you gave these to me. And she looked at me with a glare. It said, my son is more liberal than you'll ever be. What's your point? I was like, all right, no point. And we ended up doing it. We got along wonderfully, Mrs. Reagan and I. In fact, when the Diaries came out, that they were trying to cut some bits about Saudi Arabia out, the security clearance people in D.C., and Mrs. Reagan got on the phone, and James Baker, I teach at Rice University where Secretary of State Baker's at, and Baker said it's the only person when Nancy Reagan called, he would get terrified of her telephone calls. She was a rough number. But I did the Reagan Diaries, and it became a big hit. And I had also got Nancy Reagan's attention. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker called Ronald Reagan's Pen Pal, because one day a woman named Lorraine Wagner from Philadelphia, who works for the Internal Revenue Service, randomly reached me at my office and said, I have all these personal letters that Ronald Reagan wrote me. And I said, what? And I was trying to judge, is this a crackpot or not, you know? And I kept saying, are they Xeroxes? Are they forum letters? But I did an interrogation of sorts, and I said, can you just fax me one or two of your best hits, and let me see what's there? And she goes, no, I don't have a fax machine. I will not fax it. So I made a judgment. I got on a plane. A former writer, James Chase, who's trying in Haiti, once said, always get on the plane. If you're going to write on Haiti, go to Haiti. And I just said, I got to fly to Philadelphia. I landed there, went to Lorraine Wagner's, and lo and behold, in a little kind of a townhouse there, she had a box of 100, I think it was 200 plus letters that Ronald Reagan wrote her.
What years?
She started in the 40s. Lorraine was the head of Ronald Reagan's fan club in Philadelphia and wrote him fan letters early in his movie career. He met her, then she invited him these things. Well, it's a long story, but these are beautiful letters. And Lorraine ended up saving them, and Nancy Reagan knew about it. It wasn't a mistress or something. You know, they became known that they would do it. So Reagan, when he was at Bitburg Cemetery, or when he was at with Gorbachev, that same day he would write letters to Lorraine Wagner. I was stunned to find this kind of thing. And Mrs. Reagan knew Lorraine and thought I handled it well without making a kind of sexual innuendo or something in the New Yorker magazine.
Can I ask a quick question? Were there many Ronald Reagan fan clubs by city?
No, there weren't. Yeah, well, they were. There were some.
Yeah.
He was starting to, but she ran the Philly one. She had all these pictures of her and Ronald Reagan, and you know, he came to her. She would go to Ronald Reagan days in Illinois every year when he was young, all this kind of stuff. But just to pick up on some of our conversation here, one, Bret, there have been psychiatrists that write about presidents. You know, famously, Sigmund Freud wrote a book about Woodrow Wilson with William Bullitt. And even now with Trump, you get a few. I look at this book question that we've been dealing with. I worked my way through Georgetown to do my doctorate, working at rare bookstores, second story books, idle time books in D.C. I would go to homes, buy rare books. And the books that are coming out on Trump right now are garbage. I don't consider them books, most of them. They're just junk. I mean, there's occasionally one or two a year that are keepable that you'd want to put in the book business a Brodart on, plastic cover to keep on a bookshelf. Most of these are quick cash things. You can tell what's in them by reading the publisher. If it's Regenry, it's a right wing. If it's The Nation, it's the left. There are a few good ones that come in there, and anybody who's a serious journalist does good one, but a lot of the number of that quantity of Trump books. But I just was at my publisher, and they still are looking for Trump books. There's like Trump deranged syndrome in publishing, like, what's the Trump angle on your book on Cesar Chavez, or what's your Trump angle on, and they're keeping looking for, he's eating up an awful lot of oxygen, Donald Trump, and in that regard. But the big thing that happens with reputations with presidents is the historians. I mean, there's great journalists, and some of them have, because they have clippings and covered them. A Usaidi covers Kennedy, wants to write a book on Kennedy, obviously, Peter Baker was covering of the New York Times Barack Obama, and he brought out a book on Obama or something. Makes sense that good journalists would do that. But the historians, over a period of time, can help elevate reputations. And I'll just pick it up with Harry Truman, so we don't go too far back. Harry Truman, they used to say to err is Truman. Truman leaves the White House with a 27% approval rating. He couldn't even run for re-election in 1952 and had to step aside and let Adlai Stevenson get the Democratic nomination. And then he was going down in history, didn't track, and then a guy named Merle Miller helped him write a book called Plain, Speaking, and Truman was, using tough, rough and ready language, and there became a Truman Renaissance, a little one. And then a great journalist named Robert Donovan did a 2-volume biography of Truman. But then David McCullough came in and did that great single volume, Truman, with almost a Grant Wood-like cover on it, and put Truman in the American grain. And because of the talents of McCullough, Truman started becoming, now we rank him in most presidential polls, Truman's 5. He went from near bottom to being ranked 5th, because of the power of the McCullough book and looking all Truman did. Susan Eisenhower's here and knows very well what I'm going to say about my late friend Steve Ambrose, who got in some trouble for plagiarism late in his career. But when he wrote his 2 volumes on Eisenhower, people were saying Eisenhower golfed and had heart attacks. That he was out to never really the great president. Well, Ambrose begins his volume on Eisenhower saying about Eisenhower was a great and good man. And then he goes on with 2 great volumes on Eisenhower. And then a man named Fred Greenstein at Princeton wrote a book called The Hidden-Handed Presidency, because what Jon Meacham and I always both quote our friend Michael Bestclaw's son, there's a 25-year kind of rule for Freedom of Information Act, till you really get the documents that come out of a presidency to see who was doing what. So to get real history, you gotta, and that's about 25 years you wait. When I try to get Ronald Reagan's letters to the Pope, which nobody's found yet, I was told that the Vatican has a 1,000-year rule. But at any rate, we now see Ike was on everything, Susan, right? I mean, he was following, writing on every document, everything. Eisenhower was a hands-on president, not a hands-off president. And his reputation, Dwight Eisenhower, is skyrocketing right now. He's emerged beyond the top 10. He's around 6 or 7 of all-time presidents. Everybody likes Ike now. Liberals like him, conservatives like him. Eisenhower, deeply underrated. Jack Kennedy, because he got shot down in his prime, is going to always be ranked, but maybe an inflated reputation. He went through his Camelot period when you got shot, William Manchester and Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen, and they built Kennedy up as everything. We named the Kennedy Space Center and Kennedy Airport and the Kennedy Performing Arts, and then there became all these The Dark Side of Camelot books, and Kennedy the Philanderer, and it went down. And then Bob Dallek came out with the Kennedy book, and it talked about his health. And we think about FDR having polio. I mean, Jack Kennedy could barely move. He was Addison's disease. He had every disease known. I mean, if I looked at the American Medical Association's list of presidents, like Jimmy Carter has 1 entry, hemorrhoids. Up until cancer, and Jack Kennedy has a list of illnesses like this, and it made us look at Kennedy a little differently. And and now we're starting to see Kennedy's strong points, which might have been technology and the space and NASA and a new way of looking at him. So the point is, guys, all these presidents go up and down, and but there's some consistent people that are never going to rise, no matter what 25-year rules. I always say I mean, William Henry Harrison was president 1 month. And then he died because he caught a cold in his inaugural. You don't want to be ranked below William Henry Harrison. And people like James Buchanan remained that for doing nothing in the Civil War. Warren Harding for having just rank corruption, Franklin Pierce, etc. So we can pretty much tell presidents aren't going to track. What does this tell us about these Trump books that was your beginning idea? I go around and meet, I know I've talked to today, a lot of people, even at dinner tonight, that own businesses. A lot of business people or people in sales in this country, they use books in their personal library as a reflection of themselves, like artwork or family photographs. People don't want you to coming into their business. You're going to get insurance, and behind them is Nixon and Trump books. There may be some in America, but everybody likes Lincoln and Washington, and Truman now because of what McCullough did, because they were leaders. And the question that Donald Trump has, is he a leader, or is he going to be so many indictments around him, and that a feeling of the Pinocchios or whatever run amok of the Washington Post, 4,000 lies and all, is his name going to be associated with corruption forever? And if it is, then that doesn't bode very well for him. On the other hand, I do think Trump's, while he's not keeping diaries like Reagan, Bret, these tweets of his, I could just see these people, the collected tweets of Donald Trump in 4 volumes. 100 years from now, scholars will be annotating what he meant by all these. It will be like this key to modern life of the Trump tweets. But he doesn't email. And by just saying, one of the tragedies for historians is that these great letters that you would find with World War II vets that would write their loved one home, we're not getting a lot of these records anymore. Emails get deleted. Donald Trump never does emailing because he didn't. He's a bit of a shaky business person and doesn't want to put in writing. And it's not just him. I don't mean to pick on him, but I wonder if for historians, it's not the same as looking at a disc, as the fun of going in an archive and looking at all these documents of our nation's past. And so I think the technology revolution we'll be talking about this book conference since the 1970s to today, and the new ways of doing things, we have a much greater video archive. And now video sound bites. If I go and ask a lot of people the sound bites of video of your lifetime, Jack Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, what can you do for country? Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Barack Obama, yes, we can. Bill Clinton, I did not have sex with that woman. And people remember that. So now Bill Clinton, when he left, he won a 2-term president, left the economy balanced budget surplus. Clinton should have been a wife who became a historic senator and all this, and Clinton's stock is going this way, as you said. It's going very down now because he's getting trapped in the current Me Too movement, and Lewinsky's starting to look differently, and his wife lost, and he's not seen as the power broker that we looked at even 4 or 5 years ago. So Clinton's stock is very low right now. I asked my publisher about, is it worth doing a book called The Empty Chairs, Bill Clinton and the Oklahoma City bombing. He said, who's going to buy a Clinton book? It's like Oklahoma City and the biggest terrorist attack. And they said, well, but no conservative wants to go to the bookstore and buy Bill Clinton books. So that's 50% of your market off. And the progressive movement of the left today, they're angry at him. Hillary lost. Who's going to buy that book? Which means, who's your audience? Now, a good book can transcend that. A really
Doug, I would just
great book
Bret
will
would get
transcend
very
that.
I'm thinking of listening to what you're saying, and it strikes me that there are 2 kinds of leaders. Those who, either from the front or behind the scenes, really shape their time. And then there are those who symbolize it. And listening to you, it strikes me that Trump really symbolizes more than anything the period that we're living in, whether it is the populist sentiments that he represents, the choice of technological media by which he communicates with his base, with the rest of the country, the way in which his detractors respond to him, and the quality of reality TV that increasingly strikes me as defining the way in which we look at news. I mean, I was so struck during the whole Covington story that, you know, we've now reached a point in American history where everything is simultaneously micro and meta, right? Was that young boy who was squaring off against the Native American man, was that a smirk? Was that a microaggression? And the country convulsed over this question of what the 17-year-old's lips were doing at that time. And then, of course, it was all meta because it was about race, it was about white privilege, it was about the symbolism of the MAGA hat and whether that's the Ku Klux Klan vest of the day. And all the time I'm thinking, you know, people are dying of malnutrition in Venezuela, and we have real issues taking place abroad and at home, and none of that is being covered because we have entered into this alternative universe.
That's a good point. And to that point, the State of the Union's coming up next Tuesday, and everybody's doing the body language. Not even the substance or what our policy are, but who stood, who clapped, who did it. And we're focused on that visual. Young people today feed off of visual imagery more than the written word. You'd be surprised how we've kind of made kids get information. They feel everything's on their phone. They could show Valley Forge. I could tell you, what do you want to know about it, without reading the deep books. And I'm concerned about that a little bit. But I think that's a great point. And some presidents are transformational. Some are enduring leaders, but others are symbolic of an age. Nixon and Trump.
And this is just one quick point that I want to make. You know, we think of the Middle Ages as a dark period because it was not a literary period. It was actually a period defined by the image. And one of my great fears, as part of the kind of my view of the general shallowing of our culture, is precisely the point that you made earlier, which is that we have moved from a literary period where what mattered was what the president wrote or his speechwriters wrote. What was the literary substance of that era, to an image-based era, which requires a very different form of analysis, and also kind of denudes us of layers of context and understanding by which we really can have meaningful conversations about about presidencies. I mean, one of the reasons I think this festival is so important, I mean, nationally important, is that it is preserving the life of the literary mind in an era where everything is video, everything is Instagram and image.
I think you know what, that's a great way to end this panel, and to end it by celebrating this terrific festival and celebrating these wonderful four panelists. Please join me in thanking them, and look forward to seeing all of you. Great.
Oh, yeah.